Thank you, Kigaku, and welcome everybody to this morning session. We're so grateful that you're all here, and of course, you're the ones who make it possible for us to be doing this. So, Roshi, would you like to say a few things?
Thank you, Al. I'm reminded of something Amy and Francisco said years ago about the most interesting and powerful laboratory, and that is the laboratory between the ears. And having them talk about that reminded me so much of some words from Eihei Dogen, who was the founder of the Soto school in Japan in the 13th century. And this comes from a fascicle called the Genjo Koan. And I just would like to set it in place as we begin this second day of the Varela Symposium, because I feel that Dogen and Francisco Varela were extremely aligned in how they viewed reality. And so Dogen wrote in the fascicle, the Genjo Koan, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. And when actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. This means we're in this state of non-separation. No trace of enlightenment remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So I think that the Cisco's imperative to identify the blind spot in cognitive science was so related to how we access our lived experience, and also his own direct experience and his investigation into the mind, not being only between the ears, but in relation to the myriad things of how one becomes aware. And so Francisco's emphasis on the first person perspective is something that has influenced many of us. And also how we actually develop the ability to access our lived experience. So I wanted just to start off this day with Dogen's perspective, which is so integral to our own view here at Upaya. It's accessing the self, forgetting the self, and being actualized then by the myriad of things. And the Genjo Koan is an extraordinary fascicle, piece of writing on the exact content that we're exploring here in our symposium. And I think what I'm going to do is to ask Joanne to put the whole fascicle onto the resource page, because I think it's an important foundation from the Buddhist perspective and the Zen that we make together, and am appreciating more and more the fact that Richie is his life is directed so deeply toward direct practice realization, not just the conventional science, which has been, groundbreaking over these decades in relation to the exploration of the neural substrate of this, that, and the other thing. But also to come into a place where the reference points that make us so comfortable from the point of view of science begin to disappear, and then something else is emerging. And I believe Richie will be sharing that in his presentation. So Richie, I'm remembering 1992 when you and I first met in Dharamsala, and our time together in Kashmir Cottage. with Francisco. And this also the incredible adventure of hauling all of this equipment that Cliff Sarin had organized from the United States to Delhi, from Delhi on that doggone train. If you remember being in that train station, and then to Dharamsala, and then you all, hiking it up into the mountains. For what? I think this is part of the unfolding of exactly that process, that adventure. And thank you very much, Richie, for your courage in this field.
Thank you so much, Roshi. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be with all of you today. One of the crazy consequences of the pandemic is that I'm sitting here in our little river sort of meditation cottage on the Wisconsin River. This is the land of the Menominee and the Ho-Chunk. Just about 500 feet to my right are effigy mounds that Susan and I visited yesterday. So we're sitting here on sacred ground. I'm overlooking the Wisconsin River. About 45 miles to the right is the Mississippi. The right is going west. So it's really very special to do this Varela retreat symposium from this location. And as I mentioned a few times before, I always look forward to preparing for these talks. I prepare more for this talk than any that I give these days. And it really is a joy. And so I'm going to launch in and share my slides. Let's see. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So here is an outline of what I hope to get through. We have 40 minutes. I'm mindful of time, and so none of these topics will really be covered in depth, but I hope to convey some arc that begins with the 4 pillars of well-being that is central to a lot of the work that we're doing now in our center. And I'm going to be particularly talking about 2 of those pillars. The first is awareness. And I introduce awareness because self-awareness, which is part of this awareness element, is required for self-knowledge. And I'm going to spend more of the time on self-knowledge, but I'll introduce here a little bit of the neuroscience and the default mode, and then move to another pillar, which is insight. And insight is about self-knowledge. And here is where I will consider a little bit of the construction of the self, talk a little bit about predictive coding and the construction of the self, and specifically link the default mode to the self. And then talk about insight practices and the brain. And here there is just a little bit of work. There has, as I'm sure most of the folks on this webinar know, a privileging of focus on mindfulness practices in the science of meditation in the West, and much less on insight practices. And here's where I'll also talk about this idea of microdosing or micro-interventions and give some very specific empirical examples, and use this as a call for the urgent need to bring this out in the most widespread possible way, and to think of this as a public health issue. And I'll then talk about the evolution or the arc of practice from beginning stages to more advanced and then to more expert stages, and underscore the fact that the neural correlates of meditation will differ dramatically at these different stages of practice. And it's really important to keep this in mind. And this leads us to consider some of the consequences of long-term practice. And here I will talk about love. So that is the arc. So this is the 4 pillars of well-being. This is a paper that came out just a few months ago, and it articulates a framework for what we think of as the plasticity of well-being. So we considered the available science in conjunction with the contemplative traditions, particularly Buddhism, to specify the minimal set of elements required for nurturing well-being. And this is what we came up with: awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. And there are practices in the Buddhist tradition that are designed to cultivate each of these. And today, I'm going to focus on 2 of these elements. One is awareness, and awareness is about being present. It's where mindfulness would be included. It's also where self-awareness and meta-awareness will be included. And also this 3rd pillar, insight. Insight is about self-inquiry, and this is really where the subject matter of this self resides, self-knowledge and self-transcendence. So let's now dive in and talk a little bit about awareness. We think of awareness as a heightened and flexible attentiveness to sensory experiences like hearing and seeing, as well as internal experiences such as bodily sensations, thoughts, and emotions. With higher levels of awareness, we can feel present with what we're doing, with who we are, and with our own internal states. And with lower levels of awareness, we may be distracted, absorbed in what we're doing, and on autopilot. And we have coined a phrase that we call experiential fusion. And experiential fusion we define as absorption in the contents of consciousness, leading to a diminished capacity to monitor and or regulate psychological, and I would also include biological processes. And many people ask about flow and its relationship to awareness. And flow can occur with or without meta-awareness. Flow can exemplify experiential fusion, but it need not exemplify experiential fusion. So in contrast to experiential fusion, there is meta-awareness. Meta-awareness is awareness of the processes occurring in consciousness, the processes of thinking, feeling, perceiving, etc. And this little section on awareness is an important prelude for us to consider insight in a few moments. So I want to say a bit about the default mode. I'm going to talk more about it when we get to insight, but I want to first share with you a few things. One is this top brain diagram is a mid-sagittal section of the brain. So if the brain is sliced in half right through the nose and cracked open, which of course we can do non-invasively with MRI scanners very easily these days, this is what you see. This is the mid-sagittal surface of the brain. And this is a good view to illustrate 2 of the key nodes of the default mode. One node is labeled MPFC, which stands for the medial prefrontal cortex, so the front of the brain is on the right here. And the other node is labeled PCC, or the posterior cingulate cortex, which is toward the back of the brain on the left. Now, how is this default mode first discovered? It's really an interesting story in the history of science. It was discovered by Mark Rakel. Mark Rakel is actually a radiologist by training, who is a wonderful man at Washington University in St. Louis. And this was in the very early days of brain imaging. It was actually before MRI, functional MRI was developed, and they were using positron emission tomography to look at the brain. And they noticed something really interesting and unusual, and it's a testament to Mark that he actually noticed this. What they noticed is that when you gave a person an active cognitive task that required sort of effortful thinking, there were a set of regions in the brain that systematically deactivated. And the way they were able to discern that is they compared the difficult cognitive task to a condition that was, quote, resting, where a person was simply told to please rest. That was the instruction. And what they observed is that when they do that contrast, there were a set of regions that are activated and a set of regions that are deactivated. The regions that are activated are regions involving the task, whatever the task might be. So if it's a language task, it would be areas in the brain that are associated with language. But they also saw a deactivation in a non-random pattern. And the areas that were deactivated were the default mode. Now, it's interesting because there are people elect to do difficult cognitive problems for leisure. They do crossword puzzles, Sudoku, stuff like that. They may play video games. Why do people elect to engage in those kind of activities during their, quote, leisure time? Well, one hypothesis is they elect to engage in those activities to suppress their default mode. And it turns out that the default mode is associated with the monkey mind, as Mingyur Rinpoche would say. Yada, 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 blah, 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 blah. It's all of the self-relevant noise that we have going on in our head. And when we are given a demanding task, there is a transient decrease in activity in these regions. But the bad news is, or the sad news, and it's not surprising news, is that when you stop doing those tasks, the default mode pops right back. It is it's like a drug. It produces a transient change, but then it reemerges. Now, I'll say more about the default mode later when we get to insight into the self. And I'll actually show you this figure again a little bit later and explain more of the dots on here. But let me just say that DMN stands for default mode network. And the sort of brownish circle you see here in this region of the medial prefrontal cortex and also in the posterior cingulate cortex. Okay, now I want to just give an example. This is one of a whole industry, cottage industry of studies like this. This happens to be a study that came out in 2021. It just came out actually a few weeks ago. And the senior author is a former postdoc of mine. Just promoting his work. What they're doing in this study is they're looking at a large group of adolescents, some of whom have depression, some of whom are typically developing. And they're looking at default mode activity, and they're also using experience sampling to look at their emotions during the day across many days. So for those of you who don't know, experience sampling, or as it's now called in the psychological literature, ecological momentary assessment, is where people are essentially texted with, of course, with their permission throughout a day. And they're asked with very short questions to report on how they're feeling right now. And so let me just show you, this is, these are the individual data points for every participant, and TD stands for typically developing, AH stands for anhedonic. These are the depressed adolescents. And on the x-axis is simply the time points for the ecological momentary assessment. EMA stands for ecological momentary assessment. And on the top series of figures is positive affect. On the bottom series is negative affect. And these are admittedly broad and crude constructs, but the adolescents were asked to report on how they're feeling right at the moment they get the text. And they're queried many times a day for several days. And there are a few things to notice. First, you can see that the depressed adolescents in general are showing lower levels of positive affect than the typically developing kids. With negative affect, they're showing more variability. And if you actually look at summaries of those data, let me just say something also about this next figure, which is important. The participants were given a task where they were asked to write about a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral topic during one condition. And they queried the adolescents when they were doing that to see if they were on task or their mind was wandering. And they determined their affect when their mind was wandering. And on the top graph, there's positive affect, the bottom is negative affect. And one of the things to notice is that among the depressed adolescents who are in this bluish gray, when their mind is wandering, they have less positive affect and more negative affect than when their mind is not wandering. You can see there's a teeny dot here. You might not be able to see it. I'm using my cursor. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but these are the typically developing kids, and the radius of each circle is proportional to the frequency of samples during each of these conditions. And what this means is that for the typically developing kids, they're showing very little mind wandering during this period when particularly when they're telling unpleasant stories. Whereas the depressed kids are showing more mind wandering and they're showing less positive affect. So these are just meant to capture the affective dynamics. And what you then see, these kids were then brought into the laboratory and they were scanned. And what you see here that I want to specifically focus on is a strong link between the default mode and another network that we call the salience network, which is a network that sort of, you can think of it as these are parts of the brain that amplify stuff that's important. And the prominent structure in the salience network is the insula. It is the part of the brain it's the only part of the brain which has a viscerotopic map. So it's basically taking feedback from the body and conveying it to the brain, and it also sends signals down to the body from the brain. And there's strong coupling between the default mode and the salience network. And this is highly correlated with mind wandering. So let me just give you a couple of other examples of why this is relevant and important. So research shows that people who have higher levels of attention deficit problems have detrimental mind wandering, but that is mediated or moderated by the extent to which you're aware of mind wandering. That is the extent to which you have meta-awareness. So if you have meta-awareness of your mind wandering and you're not getting lost, mind wandering is much less detrimental. So it's not about getting rid of mind wandering. It is about being aware. So meta-awareness of mind wandering mediated the relationship between ADHD symptomatology and detrimental mind wandering, suggesting that some of the negative consequences can be ameliorated by strategies that facilitate meta-awareness. So one of those strategies that can facilitate meta-awareness is simple awareness practices. And if you attended the beautiful practice that John led this morning, part of the practice, at least the first part, was in part awareness practices, where we can use different either internal or external objects to rest our awareness on, so that we're not only aware of whatever it is that is the object of our awareness, but where we become aware of awareness itself, which is where the cultivation of meta-awareness, it becomes so important. And one of the things that's found in these kinds of practices is that there's decreased activation in regions that are regions of the default mode. And this comes from a meta-analysis that was published in 2016. And if you notice the down arrows here, these down arrows denote decreased activation in these regions. This is one of the key nodes, the medial prefrontal cortex, and a second key node, the posterior cingulate cortex, both of which I mentioned earlier, that are that show decreases in activation in this meta-analysis, which is aggregating across many different studies during different types of awareness meditation. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to insight. Insight is about a curiosity-driven self-inquiry. And for those of you who have heard the Dalai Lama talk about his own practice, it is a lot of it is focused on insight, and it's analytic meditation, where through the process of analysis, there is a robust kind of self-inquiry. So, and this self-knowledge is really about the manner in which emotions, thoughts, beliefs, and other factors shape our experience, and especially our sense of self. And having direct experiential understanding of this is liberating. It helps to free us from the shackles that these emotions, thoughts, beliefs, and expectations impose upon our experience of the world and of ourselves. So we think of the self as a process that involves contextual influences, thoughts and beliefs, emotions, biology, all impinging on this entity that we construct as the self. So now a little bit about predictive coding, which is assuming a position of great importance in the behavioral and neural sciences. And I want to just talk a little bit about what it is and also some of the early antecedents of predictive coding. There was a very famous book which changed the course of psychology that was published in 1967 called Cognitive Psychology, simple title, by Ulrich Neisser. And he really anticipated the development of predictive coding in that book. And one of the important bodies of literature that he reviewed in that book was work in the study of language acquisition. And this term analysis by synthesis is something that emerged in the psycholinguistics literature before it became predictive coding. And what analysis by synthesis basically says is that we come to understand language by essentially synthesizing it in our own mind and testing the what we synthesize or simulate, if you will, against the input that's coming in from the world. And this is really some of the early origins of predictive coding before it was subsumed within a Bayesian framework. But predictive coding at its core suggests that much of what the mind does is it makes predictions about input that is going to be received. And one of the key goals, if you will, of human behavior is to minimize the discrepancy or the error between our predictions and what is coming in. And we can think of the construction of the self to be a simple extension of this. And there are a number of neuroscientists and psychologists who have taken this kind of view. And I'd like to just share one of these. Again, there are many out there now, but this was something that was published a few years ago. And basically, it's conceptualizing a world model and the self model. And we have predicted states and actual states. And if we can think of an action that's really simple. So if I take this cup and hold it and bring it to my lips, a cursory analysis would suggest that I'm focusing on some elements in the world and constructing this entity called a cup. But there's also sensory motor and affective features that are happening. I'm aware of the proprioceptive feedback from my arm as I lift the cup. This is informing a model of the self. I have some predictions about the tea that's in this cup and how it will taste. All of these are happening, going on sort of under the hood, if you will. Some of them are conscious, some of them are not conscious, doesn't matter. But the idea is that we're making these predictions all the time. And even when we're operating in ways where we think it's focused on the quote external world, we're also engaging in all these computations that are relevant for the construction of a self. And so this is happening all the time. And there are many levels of this, from cognitive features to ones that are more contextual, to ones that are more sensory motor and affective. Now, I want to show you this again because I want to point out a second element in this figure, which are the red dots. And the red dots come from experiments that in one way or another have accessed self-related processes. So an example, a sort of canonical example of this kind of experiment is you can be given a set of adjectives and you're asked to classify whether the adjective applies to yourself or not. So for example, grumpy, friendly. You're given a series of adjectives and you're asked to say whether it's true of yourself or not, or to rate the extent to which it's true. You can be given the identical adjectives and asked to describe some famous person who's well known, maybe Donald Trump. And you're asked to, on each of these adjectives, to say whether that's true or false of this person. It turns out that, although it may be different with Donald Trump, we have not done that experiment. That may violate all kinds of previous findings. But in other cases, we know that the set of activations that you see in the brain when you're making classifications for another person are different than when you're making classification for yourself. And when you're making classification for yourself, you see more consistent activation in areas that overlap with the default mode. And these red dots are, you see in the medial prefrontal cortex, are activated during self, but not during other. So this is something particularly interesting. Now, there are some studies, and certainly there's controversy about what I'm about to show you, and I don't want to push this too hard, but there are fascinating studies that have used transcranial magnetic stimulation to actually disrupt the self-relevant network in the brain transiently. And you can do this safely. You can think of it almost as a temporary lesion. And here is a study where the exact procedure that I described, where you're rating the adjectives for your best friend versus yourself. And when you take the medial prefrontal cortex offline transiently at the right latency, you see a dramatic difference in response to the self-classification, but there's no change at all when you're making these ratings for your best friend. It is highly selective to the self. So this, again, is additional evidence that these parts of the brain have something to do with this kind of self-relevant processing, this construction that we create of ourselves. So there are psychologists who've attempted to capture this also in self-report measures. So this is an example of a study where psychologists were looking at the relationship between a quality of self-reflection and anxious and depressive symptoms. And here's the key crux of this study. If a person reports themselves to be high on insight, and insight here is an item like, I usually know why I feel the way I do. I usually know why I feel the way I do. Turns out that many people report that they don't really usually know why they feel the way they do. But if you report that you usually do know why you feel the way you do, you have insight, you have some meta-awareness, and some self-knowledge. And that actually ameliorates the, you can see it's negatively correlated, this minus 0.53, minus 0.43. So if you have high levels of insight, it will decrease your anxious and depressive symptoms. And so knowing what our minds are doing with this kind of self-knowledge is beneficial. using these kinds of methods to show that. So let me give you another example that is a different but related construct. So there's a lot of work that shows that daily stress is associated with reduced life satisfaction. Well, it turns out that if you have clarity, and that's a word that social psychologists are now using, clarity about your self-concept, which in our terms would mean that you have insight. You understand how your thoughts, emotions, and expectations are affecting how you see the world. If you have low levels of that, that is associated with reduced life satisfaction. If you have high levels of that, it buffers you. And so this study shows that our daily life stress and its association with reduced life satisfaction is mediated by having less clarity about this self-concept. Now, one of the other ways of measuring this, this is something that is really cool because it can be done so easily. And it's using pronouns, the use of personal pronouns. And specifically in this case, 3, me, myself, and I. And it's so interesting because I've had the blessing during COVID of being around my 2 grandkids, one of whom is almost 2. And she's just starting language now. And you can see in her development, all of so much of what she says, me, my, I. It's all about this agency, and she uses these personal pronouns more than any other class of word. It's so interesting. In any case, when adults use these words, it turns out if you're asked to recall a negative, something stressful or challenging that happened in your recent past, that's the task. And you look at the use, the simple frequency of me, myself, and I in your recall, it's highly correlated with symptoms of depression, with symptoms of anxiety, with brooding, and with rumination. Actually, with rumination, it's not correlated. But these 3, it's highly correlated. These are high correlations in between 0.4 and 0.7. It's really quite astounding that this is a marker of depression and anxiety. Okay, so self-inquiry is the intentional, curiosity-driven investigation of self-related beliefs and psychological processes. And I'm super mindful of the time. I'm going to have to skip some things. Which is always the case when I do these Varela talks. So with your permission, I'm going to actually stop sharing my slides for a second. I'm going to move ahead, and I will, in the interests of being a good team player, I'm going to move on.
And Richie, we could reduce the discussion by, some minutes.
Well, I'll just take another 5 minutes max.
Okay,
so
thank you.
So let me just do a little bit on microdosing. I know this was a topic of interest to Roshi. This is something that I think is really practical, is super important, and has received almost no, actually in the contemplative science literature, to the best of my knowledge, it's received 0 attention. What I think of as a micro-intervention is an intervention that's really short, that can be inserted in the right place and the right time. And by really short, the ones we're starting to experiment with are between 30 seconds and 1.5 minutes. So we don't have time to do a little practice, but imagine that you're about to go into an important meeting and you take 30 seconds to simply reflect on each of the people you're going to be meeting with, and recall one thing that they've done to the best of your knowledge that has been helpful to others or to this enterprise in which you're all involved, and allow this sense of appreciation to emerge. It could be as short as 30 seconds. You can do this before each meal. It's something part of certainly the Upaya community, to spend just a short amount of time expressing gratitude in one way or another. And this can be sprinkled through everyday life. So let me give you a couple of wild examples from related domains. This is a study, this is not fringe science. This was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy a few years ago. This, believe it or not, was a 15-minute intervention in minority middle schoolers, and they tracked them for 7 years. The intervention was simply to write about the values that were most important to them for 15 minutes. And there was a control group where they wrote about a neutral topic. 7 years later, the participants who are in the affirmation group, where they wrote about affirming values, were significantly more likely to enroll in college. And they were significantly more likely to be at a more selective university. This is based on a 15-minute intervention. This is a large sample, so they're able to see these effects. This is another example, just in the lab, but this is a values affirmation task that took about 2 minutes, where, again, it's the same kind of writing task. And this is in response to a stressful challenge measuring cortisol levels. And when you wrote about values that were transcendent, that go beyond yourself, it shows a significant biological impact that's very robust. And this is based on, a 2-minute intervention. Then in this case, another paper, again, the same kind of self-affirmation task. And here, one example, think of a time, and people rate values that are important to them. So let's say a person rates that religious values are important. Think of a time when religious values might give you a purpose in life. And the control condition, think of a situation when you might check the weather. Just that. And these are all sedentary adults. And then they get health messages about the importance of being active. And it turns out that, I don't have time to go into all the detail, but people who got this self-affirmation changed the brain in a specific way, and they were less sedentary. So these are real neural and behavioral consequences based on minuscule interventions that represent interventions under 5 minutes. So I don't have time to talk about the evolution of practice, but in the end stages of practice, this is from Yeshe Tsogyal, the great 8th century yogini, who said, when you look within and observe, you'll come to see yourself, yet there is no thing there to see. This seeing is itself recognition. It is this we call the view. And one of the important parts of my own personal practice is the working with a text from the third Karmapa the aspiration of the Mahamudra. And I don't have time to read all this, but I'll read just the second page to you. Clinging to good experiences is freed on its own. The confusion of negative thoughts is naturally purified into basic space. Ordinary mind is beyond being accepted or rejected. It cannot be lost or gained. May we realize this freedom from concepts, the truth of reality itself. Beings have always been Buddhas by their very nature. Yet not knowing this, they wander endlessly in samsara. For those beings who experience suffering without end, may overwhelming compassion take birth in our minds. In the moment of love, with the unceasing force of unbearable compassion, the truth of the empty essence nakedly dawns. This unity is the unerring supreme path. Now, I'm going to spend one more minute just saying to you that talking about love in the aspiration of the Mahamudra, this book, I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but P.M. Sorokin was the founding chair of the Department of Sociology at Harvard. And he established a center on creative altruism at Harvard that unfortunately no longer exists. But this is a very serious analysis of the power of love. And he has 5 dimensions of love in this book: intensity, extensivity, duration, purity, and adequacy. And I want to just read you one quote, and then I'm going to end. This is from Sorokin. He said, "Love is the experience that annuls our individual loneliness, fills the emptiness of our isolation with the richest value, breaks and transcends the narrow walls of our little egos, makes us co-participants in the highest life of humanity and in the whole cosmos, expands our true individuality to the immeasurable boundaries of the universe." And now to end, I want to read one final quote from Nelson Mandela, where he said, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richie. I really appreciate it. Roshi, I'm going to defer to you to what you'd like to do in way of revising the schedule before we go to Amy for her comments. You're muted, Roshi. Yeah, you're muted. There you go. Thank you.
There are several questions in the chat stream that I think are really valuable, Al. I'd love you to scan those questions and pose them to Richie. I'm sure he can respond concisely, and then we'll move to Amy.
Okay, and just so I'm clear, so will we, I'm very mindful of respecting Elena's time for her presentation. So I just want to make sure I'm clear about how we're going to do that.
So I think we'll have a 5-minute break at the hour.
Okay, so 5 minutes for some things that are in the Q&A. So Richie, just scanning through these, there were a few questions that had to do with, for example, some of these go into the detail of the particular studies, but why in the one in which there was the brief 15-minute writing intervention, the effect was seen for the African-American students, but not for the Anglo students?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure the answer, other than that there's probably more room to move, so to speak. So the baseline from which they started was unfortunately different because of issues of that we're all acutely familiar with, of the impact of systemic racism. But that's the likely answer, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just quickly, I'm trying to find the ones that are a little more tractable in the time we have.
Marika asks about stickiness. She says there's increasing evidence that the stickiness of the mind wandering also matters.
Yeah, thank you, Marika. Great to have you here. And it's a great question. And, you know, I think that stickiness is really related to self-grasping. And I would expect that measures associated with self-grasping and self-identification are going to be highly predictive of stickiness. You know, someone should look at the use of personal pronouns in stickiness. I would predict there would be a correlation.
Great, thank you. Maybe one more here. Nancy Hardaway is interested in what you offered regarding this notion of microdosing. And I think is asking about whether there's any evidence pertaining to the practice of gratitude or the practice of examination of one's own values in this microdosing sense.
Yeah, so the value stuff has been the most well studied, and it's amazing how little it takes to essentially bring to the foreground in one's mind core values that a person considers important to herself, and the impact that that has. I mean, it just happens like that. It doesn't. You know, in less than 1 minute, you can do this kind of value affirmation exercise and have a dramatic consequence. And in the case of this study with minority middle school kids, the effects, you know, were seen 7 years later. It's kind of remarkable. Really
interesting. So I think this is a quick one, so we'll fit in one more for you, Richie. Hannah SW is asking about whether there were studies that looked in more detail at gender in addition to race, and I think this pertains to some of these brief intervention studies you commented on.
Yeah. In terms of the effects of the value affirmation, I don't know of any explicitly. With regard to gender and this area, one of the most interesting issues is that before adolescence, the prevalence and frequency of depressive symptoms is identical in boys and girls. After adolescence, it's double in girls compared to boys, and that gender difference persists for most of life, and that's true in every Western country in which this has been examined. And that, to me, you know, I think it has something to do with self-related processing, and I also think it's crying out for to test an intervention that can be delivered pre-adolescence to see if we can shrink that gender difference as kids go through adolescence. And of course, this is also responsible for countless suicides, and it's a huge public health issue.
Really interesting idea. So Amy, with sincere apologies for constricting your time as for comments here as the discussant, let's turn it over to you.
Thank you, Al. No, there's no problem with that, since I have no neuroscience hat to put on, unfortunately. But I did have a question about, that was kind of kicked off by when you were speaking about the coupling between the default mode work in the salience network, and the salience network is being the primary, I think you said, viscerotopic map related with. So what obviously that brought to mind, and actually all these questions about adolescence and depression, anxiety bring to mind, is the body. And so
Yes.
first I was wondering actually why you brought in that coupling, because I couldn't find a follow-up to it in your talk, but that's because of, just the way things. So what does that signify, that coupling in this particular context of predictive coding, or is it related to the context of the predictive coding? So that was one of my questions. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for asking that. And I think that the way I presented it was so truncated, it was impossible to understand. So I really appreciate the question. So the link to the salience network. So what this study showed is increased coupling between the default network and the salience network. And it basically, the salience network is amplifying the default network. It is making the activity of the default network more salient. And so it is increasing the disturbing nature of mind wandering, and particularly self-relevant mind wandering in the case of these depressed adolescents in this study. And so that was the link there. It was simply to show that when the default mode gets coupled to the salience network, it jacks up the importance to a person of these self-relevant mind wanderings. And as you also point out, Amy, it inevitably will trigger stuff in the body too.
Yeah.
And so it's not just happening in the head. It's an embodied experience.
It will trigger things. It will also hear things coming from the body. No, also
Absolutely. It goes both directions. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The other question I had, but I think we'll probably end up talking
why don't we go ahead? Yeah, go ahead with that, and we'll limit our break time.
Well, it's just a sort of a what did you call it? One of those quick interventions where you're supposed to say quickly, if I'm texting you, Richie. What are you microdosing?
We're microdosing. The way I think about it is, in the Buddhist framework, we have view, meditation, and application. And in most cases, I think what we're microdosing is actually the view. We're giving snippets of the view, just short little snippets. And there are a number of studies which show that the actual, you can think of the mechanics of meditation, and I'm certainly consider myself fairly unqualified to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. And those of you who know better can correct me. But in many ways, you can think of the mechanics of meditation as really there to consolidate the view. But what's producing the real change is the view. The meditation is helping you remember the view over and over again in every nook and cranny of your everyday life. That's what the mechanics of meditation is doing. But if you artificially sprinkle the view so that it's just happening and reminding you, it's kind of like, it's not a shortcut, but it is a way in for the masses. So, because they're not going to put their butts on the cushion like we do. So let's sprinkle the view. Let's get aerosols of the view all over the friggin' place.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. Provocative questions. I really appreciate it. And Richie for a wonderful talk. So we will have a brief break now. Let's limit it to 10 minutes if we could. I know that's unmercifully short, but that will allow us to get closer back on schedule, and we'll have all the full time for Elena's talk, and then I'll shorten the discussion following that by just a little bit. So that's
And
our
Al,
plan.
I hope Richie can post his slides as a PDF.
Yeah,
Happy to do that.
that'd be wonderful. Also, if Kigaku is on, there have been a couple of requests from the Q&A that observations be shared with Richie. So if those could be saved and perhaps sent along to him, that'd be wonderful.
Certainly.
Thank you so much.
I love that. Thank you.
See you in 10. Thanks again, Richie.
Thank you, Richie.
Thank you.
Thank you.